Well, we're continuing our discussion with Dr. Eric Bailey, and we had great discussion on corn silage and management and some rules of thumb on feeding. But it's also time in the fall to start planning for spring, because we got to think about next spring, summer, and even next fall as far as what we're going to feed. So, what should we be thinking about now?
Well, so we're going into the winter with dry conditions, right?
Uh-huh.
So we're not rebuilding soil moisture. I'm a little concerned that if we have continued dry weather, we might end up starting the spring with one hand behind our backs. Our forage might be getting off to a late start in perennial pasture, tall fescue pastures. So,
Because do our perennials get set up in the fall for
absolutely,
spring?
yeah. So cool season grasses, right? So they don't follow our calendar. Their year starts in the fall, right? And so they're vegetative in the fall. They go dormant in the winter. They reemerge in the spring, vegetative again. Then they go reproductive, and then they go dormant in the summer. So really, the fall is kind of the start of their calendar year. So yeah, there's potential from my perspective, one, for us to do damage by grazing the pastures into the ground, forcing them to use their root carbohydrate reserves to generate new leaf material, because the leaves are where they're harvesting sunlight with, right? So that's a concern. If we have to start feeding hay early in the fall because it's dry, then that makes bale counting in February and March tight, right? And
right.
And then if we've got, a late start to our growing season and hay feeding season stretches out longer, that just puts a lot of pressure on those inventories when we have barely filled the barns back up after the last drought. So
Because we got lucky last year, we had a very mild winter.
Yep.
If I know we're going into La Nina now, I believe, which a little bit rougher winters usually,
Yep.
longer winters,
Yep.
wet winters. And that could cause some issues.
Yeah, that's the mild winter we had last year saved our bacon, because
Yes.
our hay supplies across the state were real tight,
And we greened up early.
So
we got on the pastures, which was great. I know that saved a lot, like you said. So every fall we should be planting. So what should we be looking at now?
That's a great question, Tim, and I'm gonna take a hard left turn off of that.
All right.
Here. So I think one of the things that I'm concerned about, and I think I can say this because I've been here long enough that I feel like I've got a feel for the system. We've done a lot promoting the use of stockpiling forages and pastures, and I don't know that the return on investment is there. Hear me out before everybody gets their pitchforks out.
Well, mine's sharp right now.
My concern is I've been in Missouri for 7 years now, and I've seen 2 falls where we've had adequate precipitation to develop stockpile.
2 out of 7.
2 out of 7. And I've got other colleagues who will say that the stockpile they've seen has been 1 out of 5.
Oh, wow.
Okay? Every pound of nitrogen that we put down in the fall should grow somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 pounds of additional forage dry matter. That comes at an expense, though, right? We generally tell people to put down 40 units of nitrogen in the fall, and if nitrogen costs let's say 70 cents a pound, I know I'm over, it's in the 60s right now, but let's say 70 cents, that's $28 an acre that you're spending right there. What's my return on investment from that practice? More importantly, I think from a carrying capacity standpoint on the farm, I think a question that we have to ask ourselves, are the stocking rates that we are currently using on our farms appropriate for what our land will produce in terms of forage? I mean, historically we've talked about fescue producing, 4 tons of forage dry matter per acre, but and that's a big broad stroke. And I know that everybody's soil type and topography is different and climate is different. And that's just kind of a real rule of thumb, but I don't know that the right number is not 3 tons of fescue, because we're just not seeing that fall hump, right, in that fall regrowth. And I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I'm not saying that my predecessors and colleagues were wrong for promoting the use of stockpiling. I just think there's more variability in stockpiling that we have to account for when we're thinking about making these kind of big picture decisions for our farm, you know? So for example, like when I had that rent farm in Randolph County, you know, I thought I would run one set of stockers in the spring doing my double stock model, and then I'd be able to come back in the fall with about half the animals and get kind of a second graze period. And the 2 years that I did it, we had no precip in the fall, and we had to ship the cattle early both years. And that was at half the stocking rate we did in the spring. So,
and that could also affect if I'm going to plant annual cereal crops in the late summer, fall. If I don't get the rain, I won't get the growth.
Yeah, and I think that's also a fair point. Now, please don't take this away that I don't think we should do cover crops or we should do any kind of anything in the fall, but I just think I'm at least seeing data that would support the idea that there's just more variability in the precipitation during the fall. And that precipitation, right? So the number one predictor of forage production is precipitation. So,
and those are setting us up maybe for a good spring growth. You know, we plant in the fall.
Yep, absolutely.
But we're talking about winter.
That's right. Yeah, and a lot of the cover crops that we grow, right? So cereal rye, annual rye, you know, generally you get them sprouted in the fall, they go dormant, but then they produce dramatically in the spring.
Yeah, March, April.
There's not very many other than maybe oats that are prolific producers of tonnage in the fall to get you there.
Right. So we're talking about what are we going to graze in November, December, January, February?
Absolutely. And I very much appreciate the idea of a forage chain, having diversity of your forage crops in your system, both perennial and annual, to basically reduce on the amount of days that you're feeding hay. Because you have heard me say this before, but feeding hay costs 2 to 3 times what it does for a cow to graze it herself. And quite honestly, most people make the mistake, and I will say it plainly, they harvest hay at the worst time possible, and they get the lowest quality feed possible. So...
Right. It seems like we do everything else, and then we go harvest hay.
Exactly. It becomes the chore that gets done after all the other chores are done. So, and that's, you know, I'm not saying that properly harvested tall fescue is as good a quality as corn silage or alfalfa for that matter, but I think we leave some opportunity on the table when we cut hay in June and July versus cutting it in late May.
One of the better farm managers once told me, I want to be done by Mother's Day.
Yeah.
And he's producing some great quality hay.
Yeah. And a lot of the two biggest things I get pushback on about that is it's hard to find a window where it's dry enough to get it swathed, raked, dried down in that stretch of the year, which I totally appreciate. But you also have the opportunity to make baleage out of it, right? Because you can be in and out of a field if you're wet wrapping hay in 24 hours. 2, they argue that you get less tons, less pounds per acre. And they're not wrong, but the TDN value of that feed you get is greater. And so on a pounds per TDN, you get a similar amount of TDN just in a smaller package, right? And so you're getting a higher quality feed and crude protein's greater. It's just there's too many things to discount, you know.
Those mature stems don't pack much.
No, nutrition. They don't pack much nutrition, right?
So what do we do then? If stockpiling may not be the answer, what do we do?
That's a great question, Tim. You know, I circling
sell
back,
the cows.
Circling back to the original discussion, I truly believe that every person that has beef cattle in this state needs to take a very hard look at how many cows they have and what the carrying capacity of their land is and how much they're having to subsidize their cow herd with labor, iron, and oil. Right? And so by that, I mean, how much time are you spending feeding hay in the winter? How much equipment do you have to own to facilitate the feeding of hay? Right? So I did this exercise I was guest lecturing in beef production this spring, and I got on Big Iron and said, hey, let's start a farm from scratch. We're going to take a 100-acre field, and we're going to assume it's square and flat, and it's good fescue, and it's either going to go to hay production or it's going to go to grazing. What is the cost to take raw land into the hay production practice or business, or to put 5-strand barbed wire fence and dig a pond, a half-acre pond on it, and graze cattle? It took us $200,000 in equipment to get, and I didn't buy new. It was the same horsepower tractor that the Missouri fescue hay budget had on it. It was a hay trailer. It was a used pickup. It was $200,000 in equipment to facilitate the cutting of hay off of this field, and it was less than $35,000 to build the fence and
for grazing
and dig a pond for grazing.
Wow.
And so you think about it, right? So you've added value to that land when you put up the fence and you've dug a pond. All of this $200,000 you spent is going to be worth half that in 5 to 7 years, right?
That has to be replaced.
Depreciation.
Yes.
Depreciation is the silent killer of the cattle business, and I don't think that we appreciate that enough as an industry. And that's why I try to set up systems that have very low requirements for iron and oil, because and I know a lot of people gripe about the labor that it takes to feed hay in the winter too, and that's a real cost, but it's the depreciation of these assets that that's why I think a lot of folks don't make any money in the business. Now, you can come back and say, well, I run 20-year-old equipment and I've got everything paid for, and then in that case labor becomes a larger part of that cost. But the reason, Tim, that the young people aren't coming back to the farm is because it takes $200,000 to make hay off of 100 acres. And
also, you're exporting nutrients.
Oh, absolutely.
Even if you're keeping it on your own farm somewhere else, you got to bring them back.
Yeah, because you're not, most farmers are feeding that hay in a designated spot.
Yes.
And they're concentrating the nutrients in that area. They're not unrolling hay out across these fields, right? Because, cattle take less than 20% of the NP and K out of a bale for themselves. The vast majority of it comes out the hind end as manure and is recycled back onto the field. So we pull fertility out of these areas at a much slower rate when we graze. And in particular, we can even concentrate that manure effectively if we implement a managed grazing system. Right. So, you're absolutely right from a fertilizer value perspective. I think the question becomes, in the grazing system, outside of maybe lime, do we really need much NP or K in general? In fact, I know folks that have gone away from using NP and K just because they've really sort of doubled down on their grazing.
Whereas you take soil tests from fields that have been hayed, the P and K levels are pretty low.
Absolutely. And then you see broom sedge come in, and you've got all these other invasives, and that's certainly a big concern.
So what do we do?
I'm a big proponent of, I think we have that conversation about what our carrying capacity truly is. And I would say that the average Missouri farm does not need to have one single enterprise of livestock anymore. So back in the day, every farm had pigs and chickens and cattle. I see a future where we diversify within a livestock class like cattle. I would love to see every farm in Missouri take about half of their carrying capacity, what their land can truly support, and devote that to cows like they always have. The other half of their carrying capacity, devote that to developing heifers, grazing stockers, backgrounding their own calves, custom grazing cattle for somebody else, with the theory that essentially what I've done is I have put flexible grazers on my farm. Those cattle can come or go at any time, essentially.
Sure.
And so we get all this fescue in the spring. We have more fescue than we know what to do with for 60 days. Let it be grazed by something that can make us money, something that doesn't require $200,000 of equipment. And when there's no more grass to graze, they go home. Now, rather than 3 acres a cow, I've gone back and I've said, okay, my true stocking rate probably ought to be more like 4 to 5 acres per cow, but I'm only using half of my acres. So now, rather than, let's say, 4 acres per cow, I really have 8 acres per cow-calf pair. And so what that does is that provides drought insurance, that reduces the need for feeding hay in the winter that extends the grazing season, that facilitates easier stockpiling. To me, we have to diversify how we use our carrying capacity.
So could I say I'm going to have my stockers in the spring when I have all this forage?
Yep.
And then by July, they're gone to the feedlot.
Well, and that's the whole reason I've been doing this double stocking research in Mount Vernon and challenging the paradigm that stocker cattle don't gain weight on Kentucky 31 tall fescue. Mm-hmm. My work has clearly shown over the past 5 years that, yes, they gain a lot of weight early, but if you try to make them graze once the fescue has put up a seed head and gone dormant in late June, July, and August, they're not going to gain diddly. In fact, they might even go backwards during that period of time, but they'll gain tremendously well in April, May, and in the majority of June. So
when would that fit best with a calving that I can take full advantage of that?
So that's a great question, Tim. I think in that system, you're probably still looking at a spring calving system, right? So February, March calving system. I like the fall calving system, and I know a lot of folks have seen benefits of switching from spring to fall. But the concern with the fall calving is just simply if our fall stockpile growth is variable. Now, if I don't bring any additional outside cattle in the fall, I've got more acres to run my fall pairs on, so I could probably get away with fall. But I also like the idea of having as many animal units on the place as possible in the spring, eating as much of that excess forage away, so that I don't have to harvest the excess forage as dry hay. So
if it's born in February, it's going to be weaned
September, October.
So that's when it's going to be.
Okay. Yeah, so then I'm basically trying to get a dry cow through the winter rather than trying to get a nursing, lactating cow. Because we know that there's every 2.5 days that a calf is weaned off of a cow is 1 day's worth of feed for a cow in the milk that she produces, right? So her nutrient requirements drop by 40% when the calf is weaned. And so if I'm going to go into my toughest forage months, I would want to do that with animals at the lowest nutrient requirements.
Sure.
I think the question that comes up when I talk about these things, that sounds like something that a guy that has 500 cows could do most effectively. That's not an unfair criticism, but even a guy with 100 cows, if he cuts down to 50 cows, he'll still have room for a semi-load of stockers in the spring. So the logistic numbers work. Now, the guy that has 35 cows, I think that's where the question gets more difficult, right? Because at that point, okay, so I'm going to have 20 cows and 40 stockers. And, like the numbers get too small where it's like, does it really make sense? To those folks, I would say, do you really have to have cows? Should I just have stockers instead?
Right.
Or do I try to expand my business by taking on lease ground so that I can grow the operation? Or simply, do I custom graze for somebody else? I mean, that's where the ultimate flexibility comes in custom grazing. And I mean, just think about a custom grazing business where in 2022 and 2023, if you had grass, right? So George Carlin said back in the 70s, he who has all the supply can demand whatever he wants for it. He said it a little more colorfully than that, but if you think about it, I mean, there were guys last year and the year before that were spending over $4 a cow a day in hay, right?
Oh, wow.
So even if you as a custom grazer came in and said, hey, Tim, come graze your cows on my farm for $250 a day, which is a double what the kind of prevailing market rate for grazing dry cows is, you win, I win.
Sure.
Everybody wins in that case because you cut your feed bill in the winter substantially. You get paid above market rate because your grass appreciated. I think the smaller you are, the more flexible you've got to be. And beef cows, I love cows, right? So people have accused me of being anti mama cow. I grew up with cows. I do not have a problem with them, but the fundamental weakness of a beef cow, she's got to eat 365 days a year, and our grass does not grow 365 days a year.
That's really intriguing because I think you and some of your colleagues have said that if you get right down to it, those with 35 head don't make any money. They actually lose money.
Well, and yeah, so
because their costs are more.
Well, and that's the hard part about this too, is that even the closer we get to the smaller beef operations, it becomes less about economics and more about egonomics.
Yeah.
And so, but then when you're losing on a smaller scale. So
Right.
you may not feel it. And so, that becomes challenging. That Wesley Tucker came up with that egonomics term. That is definitely not mine, but it's so good that I steal it and use it every place I can get.
If you just have stockers, your investment's not that much.
Yeah.
And it's shorter period.
Yep.
You can get out anytime you want.
Yep.
You can skip it if you need to, but you still have animals on your place. You
Yep.
still there's a lot of it with less headaches because having babies is not easy.
Oh, absolutely not. No, it's definitely not. Now, I will bring up another common sort of objection to this system is playing with the market, right? So feeder cattle, stocker price goes up, it goes down, right? So you're taking on a fair bit of market risk. That's why I think you just got to find somebody else to custom graze for as you learn this other segment of the business. If you can offer a cheaper price per pound of weight gained than what they can do in their dry lot, their backgrounding lot, or in the feed lot, you'll find them. And it's going to take some hustling, calling sale barns, calling people you know. I mean, if you're willing to put a little effort in, a potential dance partner can be found where you'll take in their cattle.
But if you had that 100 acres that we talked about before of well-maintained pasture, you can get paid for your management.
Oh, absolutely.
Of your pasture, not so much your management of a mama cow and getting her bred back and getting.
Well, and that's why I get so fired up about it, because if you look at it on a pure cash flow basis, a custom grazed on leased land is the lowest barrier to entry to get into the cattle business. And that's why I rented that farm in Randolph County. It took me, so my lease was $12,000 a year, and I bought about $6,000 in equipment to get started. And I made that back the first grazing season, right? So after that, it was gravy.
Wow.
So we are not going to bring kids back to the farm with promises of equity, right? Because historically, we've built equity with farm, but we've had to subsidize the farm with off-farm income to provide cash flow to pay the bills, right? And so farming has historically been a long-term investment type play that requires having a job in town. Well, then by the time you built a farm to any size scale, you're probably 45 to 50 years old, and you have 2 full-time jobs now and kids that are probably in high school, right? So you've got more irons in the fire than you need to do with. If you could have a business that generates cash flow on day one that doesn't require hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment, that's how we give kids a fighting chance to get started in the cattle business.
Right. To get them come back to the farm.
Yep.
That's right. All right. Well, Eric, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I just gave a lot of room for thought. I've thought about my own background. That's what we did, that we backgrounded cattle in the wintertime. And in the spring when we had all the tall fescue, and in the winter where we could graze corn stalks, cover crops, and that sort of thing. So you can make it fit to what your system is.
Absolutely.
That's what's nice. All right. Well, thanks, Eric, so much. And this is it for Tim's Take. See you next time. That was great.